They say, some moments are so perfectly timed, so impossibly aligned, that they can't be accidents. They have to be something else. Fate maybe, or grace, or the universe deciding that two broken hearts need to collide at exactly the right second to save each other. March 12, 1959. A small music shop on Bleecker Street. A 17-year-old girl, standing beside her dead father's piano, crying silently as a stranger prepares to mark it for sale at a price that insults everything it represents. And 3 blocks away, in a black Cadillac, stuck in traffic, Frank Sinatra staring out the window, grief-stricken after visiting his father in the hospital, about to make a decision that will change both their lives forever. What happened in the next 60 minutes wasn't planned. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't even supposed to happen, but it did. And when it was over, a girl who'd lost everything found hope again. And a man who had everything found something he'd forgotten he was looking for. This is the true story of the day Frank Sinatra walked into a music shop and met Maria Castellano. And what happened next proved that sometimes the most important performances happen when there's no stage, no spotlight, and no audience at all. Maria Castellano's hands were shaking as she stood beside the piano. Not from cold, though the March wind outside was brutal. Not from fear, though she was terrified of what came next. She was shaking because she was about to do something irreversible, something that felt like betrayal. She was selling her father's soul for $50. The piano stood in the corner of Rossi's music shop, looking smaller than it had in their apartment, more vulnerable somehow. It was an upright mahogany, built sometime in the 1920s. The wood was scuffed. Some of the ivory on the keys was chipped. There was a scratch near the left pedal, where her little brother had dragged a toy truck across it years ago. It wasn't valuable, not in any monetary sense, but to Maria it was everything. Mr. Rossi, the shop owner, was a kind man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much sadness in this neighborhood. For sale, $50 as is. He looked at Maria with sympathy that made her want to scream. "Piccola," he said gently. "Are you absolutely certain this price? It's too low. Your papa's piano. It's worth exactly what someone will pay for it today," Maria interrupted, her voice tight. "And I need it to sell today, Mr. Rossi. Not tomorrow, not next week, today." She couldn't explain the desperation clawing at her throat, couldn't tell him that the landlord had given them until Monday. 3 days. 3 days to come up with 2 months' back rent, or they'd be on the street. Her mother still weak from pneumonia. Her 2 younger brothers, 9 and 11, all of them depending on her because Papa was gone, and she was the oldest, and there was no one else. Giuseppe Castellano had died 4 months ago. Heart attack. He'd been working late in his tailor shop, hemming a suit when his heart simply stopped. He was 52 years old. One moment he was threading a needle, humming O Sol Mo under his breath. The next moment he was gone, and he'd left behind a family with no savings, no insurance, and a piano that he'd loved more than he'd loved being practical. Papa had bought this piano in 1947, when Maria was 5. They'd been walking past a pawn shop, and he'd seen it in the window. Even at 5 years old, Maria remembered the look on his face, like he'd seen something holy. He'd gone inside, negotiated for 20 minutes, and emerged having spent nearly every dollar they had saved. Mama had been furious. They'd needed that money for winter coats, for food. But Papa had just smiled, his gentle smile, and said, "Concetta, music feeds the soul. Our children need their souls fed too." He'd been right. Giuseppe taught himself to play by ear. Every evening after 14 hours of sewing and pinning and measuring, he would come home, wash his hands, sit at that piano, and play Italian folk songs, American standards, anything he could figure out. He wasn't technically trained, but he played with so much heart that it didn't matter. Their entire building would go quiet when Giuseppe played. Neighbors would open their windows just to listen. Maria had fallen asleep to that sound every night of her childhood. The piano was her father's voice, his laughter, his presence. And now in March 1959, with the rent due, and her mother too sick to work, and her brothers too young to understand, Maria had to choose between memory and survival. She chose survival, because that's what Papa would have done. Mr. Rossi sighed and nodded. He attached the sign to the front of the piano, and Maria felt something inside her chest crack. She turned away so he wouldn't see her cry. "I'm going to step outside for a minute," she whispered. "Take your time, Cara." Maria walked out onto Bleecker Street. The afternoon was gray and cold. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter, and stood against the brick wall, letting the tears come. She cried for her father, for the music that would never fill their apartment again, for the childhood that had ended the day Papa's heart stopped. She didn't know that 3 blocks away, Frank Sinatra had just told his driver to pull over. She didn't know that in 60 seconds, her entire life was about to change. Frank Sinatra was having the worst day he'd had in months. And that was saying something because he'd had plenty of bad days recently. He'd just come from Hoboken Medical Center, where his father Marty was recovering from a stroke. Marty was stable, but seeing him in that hospital bed looking small and fragile had shaken Frank to his core. Boss Eddie said carefully, "You want me to take you back to the Waldorf?" "No," Frank said quietly. "I need to walk here in this neighborhood." "Yeah, here. Pull over." He walked without direction, hands deep in his pockets. He thought about Marty, about mortality, about how success couldn't protect you from the things that really mattered. After about 10 minutes, he found himself standing in front of a small shop with a faded sign, Rossi's Music and Used Instruments. On impulse, Frank opened the door. The bell chimed. The shop smelled like wood polish and old brass. It was comforting somehow, familiar. An older man behind the counter looked up. His eyes went wide. "Mr. Sinatra," he said, disbelieving. Frank put a finger to his lips and gave a small smile. "Just browsing, friend. Pretend I'm not here." Mr. Rossi nodded, too stunned to speak. Frank Sinatra in his shop. He watched as Frank wandered slowly through the aisles, touching instruments gently, respectfully, and then Frank stopped. He'd reached the piano in the corner. Frank stood there for a long moment just looking at it. Then he ran his hand along the top, feeling the worn mahogany. He read the sign, "For sale, $50. "Why so cheap?" Mr. Rossi came over nervous. "It belonged to a good man, Mr. Sinatra. Giuseppe Castellano. He died a few months ago. Heart attack. His daughter. She needs money urgently. She won't take more than 50. She said it has to sell today." Frank nodded slowly. He sat down on the bench, lifted the fallboard, looked at the yellowed keys, some chipped, some worn smooth from years of playing. He pressed middle C. The note rang out, slightly sharp, but warm, rich, the kind of tone you can't manufacture. "Tell me about Giuseppe," Frank said, and Mr. Rossi did. He told Frank about the Sicilian tour who'd bought this piano instead of winter coats for his family, about the immigrant who taught himself to play by ear, about the father who'd filled his tenement building with music every single night, about the 17-year-old daughter who was outside right now crying because she had to sell the only piece of her father she had left. Frank listened to every word, and then without saying anything, he started to play. He played "I'll Be Seeing You" softly like a prayer. His fingers moved across the keys with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for holding a child. The piano, despite its age, despite being out of tune, sang. It sang with a voice that came from decades of love poured into it. Mr. Rossi stood there, tears in his eyes. Frank Sinatra was playing a $50 piano in his tiny shop, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Outside, Maria had stopped crying. She'd wiped her face and was about to go back inside when she heard it. Music coming from inside the shop. Someone was playing her father's piano. She froze. The melody drifted through the door, achingly beautiful. For a moment, just a moment, it sounded like Papa. Not the same style, not the same hands, but the same heart, the same soul. Maria pushed open the door slowly. The bell chimed, and she saw him. A man in an expensive coat and fedora, sitting at her father's piano, playing like he was saying goodbye to someone he loved. She didn't recognize him at first. His back was to her, but there was something about the way he held himself, something familiar. Frank finished the song. The last note hung in the air like smoke. And then he spoke, not turning around. "This piano," he said quietly, "it's been loved. I can feel it in every key." Maria's voice came out as a whisper. "That was my father's favorite song." Frank turned around, and Maria's breath caught. She knew that face. Everyone in America knew that face. "Frank Sinatra, your father had good taste," Frank said gently. He stood up from the bench. "I'm sorry for your loss." Maria couldn't speak. She just stood there staring. Mr. Rossi started to say something, but Frank held up his hand. "What's your name?" Frank asked. "Maria. Maria Castellano." "Maria," Frank said her name like it was a song. "Mr. Rossi told me about your father, Giuseppe. He said he was a tour, said he loved music." Maria nodded. tears threatening again. He bought this piano when I was 5. Spent everything we had. My mother was so angry. But Papa said, her voice cracked. He said, music feeds the soul. Frank smiled. A real smile. Sad but warm. Your father was a wise man. He taught himself to play. Every night, after work, he'd come home exhausted, covered in thread and chalk dust, and he'd sit right there and play. The whole building would listen. Everyone loved him. I bet they did, Frank said softly. Maria looked at the piano, at the sign, at the insulting price tag that represented her desperation. I don't want to sell it, she whispered. It's all I have left of him, but my mother is sick. We're going to lose our apartment. My brother's. Her voice broke entirely. Frank reached into his jacket. He pulled out his wallet. Maria, he said carefully, how much do you need for the rent? For your mother? All of it? How much? Maria shook her head. I can't. I didn't tell you this. So you, Ted, how much? Frank repeated, his voice firmer, but still kind. Maria's voice was barely audible. $400. Frank counted out bills without hesitation. $500. He held it out to her. This is for you, for your family, and you're going to keep the piano. Maria stared at the money in his hand. Mr. Sinatra, I can't accept this. I can't. Yes, you can, Frank said. And you will because your father bought this piano instead of winter coats, because he believed in something. He believed that beauty matters, that music matters, that feeding the soul is just as important as feeding the body. And he was right, Maria. He was absolutely right. Tears were streaming down Maria's face now. Why are you doing this? Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Because I just came from visiting my father in the hospital. He had a stroke. And sitting there holding his hand, all I could think about was all the times I was too busy for him, too important, too famous, and I realized that none of that matters. None of it. The only thing that matters is the people we love, and the things we do for them when nobody's watching. He pressed the money into her hand. Your father gave you this piano, Frank continued. He gave you music. And you were about to sacrifice it to take care of your family, which is exactly what he would have done. That kind of love, Maria. That kind of sacrifice. It deserves to be honored. Maria was sobbing now. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Frank said gently. Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep playing. Or if you don't play, find someone who does. Keep this piano alive. Keep your father's music in the world. Can you do that? Maria nodded, unable to speak. Frank turned to Mr. Rossi. Take that sign down. Mr. Rossi, tears running down his own face, removed the for all sign and crumpled it up. Frank looked at the piano one more time. He ran his hand along the top. A gentle farewell. Then he walked to the door. Mr. Sinatra, Maria called out. He turned. Thank you, she said. Not just for the money. For playing his piano. For making it sing again. Frank tipped his hat. The honor was mine, kid. Your father built something beautiful. Make sure the world knows it. And then, Frank Sinatra walked out of Rossi's music shop and into the gray March afternoon. That night, Maria Castellano sat at her father's piano for the first time since he died. Her hands shook as she placed them on the keys. She didn't know how to play. Papa had never taught her. She'd always said she'd learn someday, and then someday ran out. But she pressed down on middle C, the same key Frank Sinatra had pressed that afternoon. The note rang out, slightly sharp, but warm, and Maria started to cry again, but this time they were different tears. These were tears of gratitude, of hope, of understanding that miracles do happen, even on cold March afternoons when you think you've lost everything. The next day, Maria paid the rent. She took her mother to a doctor. She bought her brother's new shoes, and she enrolled in piano lessons from a teacher 3 blocks away. She would learn to play. She would keep her father's music alive. Frank Sinatra never told anyone about that day. It wasn't for publicity. It wasn't for credit. It was just something he did because it felt right. Because he understood what it meant to love a father. Because he knew that the best things you do are the things nobody knows about. Years passed. Maria became a skilled pianist. She got married, had children, built a life. And every single day she sat at her father's piano and played. She played for her kids, she played for her neighbors. She played for anyone who would listen. and she told them all the story of the day. Frank Sinatra walked into a music shop and saved her life. In 1998, when Frank Sinatra died, Maria was watching the news coverage with her grown children and grandchildren. They were showing clips of his performances, his movies, his life. And Maria sat, the tears streaming down her face, and told her grandchildren what Frank Sinatra had really been. Not just a singer, not just a star, but a man who understood that the truest measure of success is what you do for others when there's nothing in it for you. He saved us. Maria told her grandchildren, her hand resting on the piano that was now over 70 years old. Not because he had to, not because anyone was watching, but because he saw someone in pain and decided to help. That's who Frank Sinatra was. Today, that piano still sits in Maria's family home. It's being passed down through 3 generations now. And every person who plays it knows the story, knows about Giuseppe, the Sicilian tailor, who chose beauty over practicality, knows about Maria, 17-year-old girl who almost had to sell her soul, and knows about Frank, the legend who walked into a music shop on the worst day of his life and created a miracle. Sometimes late at night, when Maria's great-grandchildren play that piano, the notes sound a little richer, a little warmer, like they're carrying the memory of everyone who ever loved that instrument. Giuseppe, Maria, and Frank Sinatra, who sat at those keys for just a few minutes one March afternoon, and reminded a broken-hearted girl that beauty is worth saving, and that music, real music, isn't just what comes out of the piano. It's what happens in the space between broken hearts and open hands. It's the song of kindness, and it never stops playing.